Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. We're just about ready to start the stream here, and I certainly hope that you enjoy yourself. Today, we're going to be talking about the siege of Louisbourg, and we're going to go through some of the details as to what exactly happened in about 30 seconds. So, welcome to the channel, everyone. Today is going to be an interesting day. I found some very nice material on the subject of the siege of Louisbourg, uh, and I actually got it from the National Film Board of Canada. So, hats off to them for doing such a wonderful job. So, we have a video that we get to watch. You don't have to look at the old hairy guy in front of you. You get to see something that's rather interesting. And during the course of the video, we can discuss things. Hi, David. Good to see you. Yeah, it's. We'll even bring up a little bit of the things about the coinage of the day as well in the video, and show what things went wrong and why the fort at Louisbourg actually failed. It was one of the most powerful forts along the coast of North America at the time. But you're going to see why it didn't make it, and how it's changed hands so often, and the history and details as to why so many of the French, the Acadians, ended up heading down towards New Orleans. All this is in today's episode, and I hope you thoroughly enjoy it. So before I start off, I will just check the chat and see how's everybody doing today. I see Christopher Ty in the house. I'm happy to see them. Of course, David, my friend. Glad to see you too. You getting ready for a nice week this week, I hope. My goodness. Yeah, I hope we get a whole bunch. Let everybody know that we're out there. We're going to have a very interesting video today, and periodically I'll end up stopping it if we find a part that we might want to discuss. And otherwise, at the end of the video, we can get together. Everybody's invited up to chit chat with me. We can discuss coinage in North America, primarily, of course, Canadian, but even period stuff. We can look up information and generally have a pretty good time today. So with that, I'm going to start our video on the siege of Louisbourg and what went on. And thank you again to the National Film Board of Canada for doing such a nice job.
The fortress of Louisbourg stands out on a damp, marshy peninsula on the east coast of the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, a symbol of the bitter 18th century struggle between Britain and France for control of the North American continent. The French went inland along the St. Lawrence River and then down the Mississippi. The British controlled the coast. By 1720, the French coastal presence had been reduced to the island of Cape Breton, or Ile Royale as the French called it, where at Louisbourg they built the most powerful fortress on the continent to that time. The fortress was built on the land of the Micmac and Abenaki Indians. But under French military protection, it quickly became one of the busiest ports on the continent, with 150 ships visiting the busy harbor every year. From Louisbourg, French ships could sail north to control access to the St. Lawrence River. From Louisbourg, the French could raid New England villages, farms, and fishing ports, and frequently did. Louisbourg became the key to the North Atlantic and to the defense of New France, as the French called Canada. The influence of this remarkable fortress, built at immense cost by the French, lasted for only 4 decades. But in that time, 3 armies, the conscripted armies of Britain and France, along with the volunteer army from the New England colonies, were involved in the struggle to control Louisbourg.
In the early 18th century, at the time of Louisbourg's heyday, colonists in North America looked to the sea for their main resource. It hadn't yet got to the point where the great push was to the inland to move in and develop the interior settlements of North America. The sea and the fishery particularly was of prime importance to New England and also, of course, to the French colonies, to Cape Breton and to Louisbourg. To maintain access to the cod fisheries, the French had to have access to it through an ice-free port. And this harbor here at Louisbourg was ice-free during the winter. It had a pretty uncomfortable climate, but France needed a port or a location somehow that guarded the mouth of St. Lawrence, had access to the cod fisheries, and was a major transshipment point, the key qualities that the French needed at the time.
The North Atlantic cod fishery quickly became by far the biggest fishery in the world, key to the growing wealth of France and England's American colonies.
It became the fourth harbor in importance in North America by the 1740s. And in that sense, created jealousies, created a certain number of problems, as well as opportunities for profit with the New England merchants. And people in, say, Newport, Rhode Island, were actually outclassed by Louisbourg because the harbor was getting bigger and profiting more and more. Year after year, you'd have large fleets coming here. The French East India Company would sometimes have 15, 20 ships in the harbor. It was really becoming quite a trade center.
The inevitable conflict which occurred really had it as its basis this whole question of economic competition. Who could control the cod fishery and who could most profit from it? Louisbourg was ideally situated to be a transshipment point. Cargoes could come north from the Caribbean or really come north as from the South Atlantic, arrive at Louisbourg, and there prepare itself then for the great crossing of the Atlantic to the ports of France.
The last ships would come here at the Lake Falls and leave. And because in the winter, of course, unnavigable, the seas are very bad. Indeed, people who landed here and they spent their first winter here would have been pretty dreary.
20 miles away, you can be in bright sunshine. In Louisbourg, you can be surrounded by fog, days of fog, of rain, of changeable climate, and so on. People complain bitterly of the weather, particularly those who were sent here for any length of time. It was very much an isolation post, something that we would call a hardship post. No question of riding in a coach to gardens and walking on Saturday afternoons and being entertained by musicians outside and things of that sort, and enjoying the carefully cultivated gardens of the chateau in France and so on. None of that was here. By and large, you were hungry for news from France. Ladies would have been desperate to hear of the new fashions and so on. But the information came only every so often.
A soldier in the Compagnie Franche was enlisted for 6 years on paper. You were enlisted in France and thought that going to the colonies was a great thing, and of course you were going to make a lot of money and marry an Indian princess and the rest of it. Years go by, and 6 years go by, and you say, well, I want to go home. The authorities might tell you, no, you're staying here. Why? Because there's not enough soldiers in garrison.
This is an important part.
When they did get their releases, they were allowed to go back to France. They didn't stay as settlers. Unlike in Canada and Louisiana, which were offered land grants and so on, and in Louisbourg, most of the men went back.
There were compensations, like the local taverns, but they were rough and ready, suitable more for soldiers and sailors than family men and women. Hundreds of sailors would arrive from the French warships or fishing fleet, well stocked with money and a burning desire to spend it. They could buy wine, women, and song, and then broke again, look for the next ship out.
Life here was certainly not for a settlement, but for commerce and for simply being a naval base.
Louisbourg was under the control of the governor, usually a high-ranking naval officer. And the social structure of the town was not very different from towns in Brittany or anywhere along the French coast on the other side of the Atlantic.
Check out classified.
Unlike the New England colonies, Louisbourg was a far more structured, bureaucratic society, a place established by government and run by government. People at the level of gentlemen or officers could write home for goods. All had to be shipped from France. If you were upper middle class, you would do everything you could to make sure that your life was lived in a fairly dignified manner. This was a class society.
There were tremendous tensions developing that were part of the whole process that led eventually to the French Revolution. You had a terrible division between the officers who wore blue uniforms in the French Navy and the officers who wore red. Red were nobility, blue were middle class, and often both sides would not talk to each other. You also had terrible animosities between those who carried the sword, the épée, and those who were the administrative officers. In microcosm that had been transferred here with some colorful addition of Indians and fishermen and so on.
So the fortress did not provide that freedom from the limitations of European society that was to be found in the New England colonies. The French, who were sent to Louisbourg, had little incentive to settle permanently. Social life would come alive with the arrival of spring.
Ships would be coming in from Europe with news, with supplies, and with new people. And so that would bring up things a bit. It wasn't all dreary, certainly. In the summer, there would be quite a lot of traffic here. It seemed to have been a well-known city by the 1740s or so because of so much traffic that was going on here. Certainly the Americans by then were quite aware of the place, and during peacetime, all sorts of ships came here. So it was a port of call which was known and appreciated fairly rapidly. Otherwise, how would we explain that it prospered so quickly? It was only started building in 1720, and 25 years later, it's one of the largest ports in North America.
That 25 years or so, when Louisbourg was at its prime, was due to the strength of those who lived here under such difficult conditions. These people from France maintained a thriving fishing port and naval base, successful enough to be a constant threat to the more populous British colonies to the south. Revenue poured into Louisbourg from both the fishery and the lively trade with the mother country and the New England colonies to the south. That commercial success impressed the New England colonists.
I bet the fishing brought in more than the beaver pelts.
But so did the immense scale of the fortifications. At that time, the French were considered to be the masters of military architecture, and Marshal Vauban, who designed Louisbourg, had an immense reputation as a builder of impregnable fortresses.
Important point there.
The British and French were once again at war in 1744. To the aggressive and restless colonists of New England, the ever-threatening Louisbourg, with its imposing appearance and rich commerce, now became a tempting target. And so, in March 1745, encouraged by Boston merchants, a volunteer army of perhaps 4,000 of the King's New England subjects sailed from Boston in 100 small ships to lay siege to the greatest French fortress in the New World. Curiously, these amateur soldiers were not in awe of the fortress, in spite of its fearsome reputation. Awaiting them in Louisbourg was a garrison of tough, experienced troops, some of them Canadian-born, but under the leadership of officers of the French army. These troops had been seasoned by their many raids and skirmishes against New England towns.
Britain and France were hereditary ancient enemies, and this rivalry got carried to North America. So to some extent, in one way you could look at it, the attack in Louisbourg was part of a long tradition of whenever there was a war on, you tried to attack the French possessions in North America. And the French as well would send raiding parties to try to attack the New England colonies.
The British government at the time were concerned about Louisbourg, but only to the extent they're looking at a global strategy of competition with France. For the New Englanders, it was a whole different issue because North America was their home. Competition with the French was a matter of life and death for them, particularly as regards the cod fishery.
Many of the New England volunteers were fishermen, men who had hatched this daring expedition without professional military advice, and at first, without even promise of British help.
The expeditionary force had been recruited from the colonies of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, a real cross-section of New England society at the time, with especially heavy weightings in people from coastal communities who really saw the chance to drive the French out of Louisbourg as something that would really benefit them economically.
They were a tough lot, these New England volunteers, rather sniffly described by a British naval officer as blacksmiths, barbers, shoemakers, and all the banditry them colonies affords. But they included wealthy merchants involved in the fish trade, as well as the sailors and fishermen who manned their boats.
And many of the New Englanders who came north with almost a crusading zeal to do away with the papist presence to the north. And at least one man was reputed to have carried an axe with which to chop to pieces the altar in the chapel. There was a lot of religious intolerance at work. There was the ancient fear, the enemy to the north. All these contributed to the New England enthusiasm, particularly from Massachusetts, for the attack on Louisbourg.
The first contingents of approximately 4,000 colonial soldiers landed here at Kennington Cove and had been carried north from the New England colonies in a fleet of approximately 100 small sloops and schooners, and were joined, of course, by Peter Warren's Royal Navy Squadron. The Louisbourg expedition was the first really large-scale military expedition that New England would participate in, and laid the foundations of a military tradition in which they had the resources, the manpower, the wealth to mount an expedition of this size with very little help from London.
The fortress was set up to resist attack from the sea, through the harbor. But the French did not believe they were vulnerable to a land attack, and were surprised when the New Englanders landed at a cove a few miles west of the fortress.
This is where the first group of New Englanders actually hit the beach, so to speak. The landing site here is between 3 and 4 miles from the fortress walls.
The French troops in the garrison knew nothing about North American military tactics. They did not expect an amphibious landing on the beach and did not move in force to repulse it. They sent out only a small detachment of troops to investigate. But most units stayed in the fortress, preparing their shot and muskets and practicing to repulse a direct attack.
I love the reenactments. They do such a nice job.
The New Englanders had learned to fight in the woods as they were clearing the frontiers of their settlements, and had adopted many tactics from their Indian adversaries. But they had also worked out a flexible, democratic, and quick approach to fighting, very much like the guerrilla warfare of later generations.
The valuable thing about the New Englanders in 1745 is that they were amateurs. And so they brought amateur enthusiasm and a willingness to consider any option to a military situation. Often the professional military of the time would only think in terms of organized sieges, organized assaults, and so on. An untrained militia will say, how can we take that objective? Let's think of any way of doing it.
When the New England fleet arrived off Louisbourg on the April 30th, 1745, just a few hundred yards up here, they encountered the small French party that had been sent out from the fortress to oppose the New England landing.
The small French party sent to investigate the landing discovered groups of New Englanders already pushing into the forest, and the two sides engaged in some firing back and forth. The French might well have repelled the New Englanders had they emerged from the fortress with a strong enough force. But they had built the fortress facing towards the sea and were confident that no one could mount a serious land attack through the swamps and forests surrounding them.
Given the odds, it was very unlikely that invaders would be able to bring heavy guns across that ground and set up batteries near the fortress walls.
The New England army, however, defied the odds and exposed the weakness and the thinking of fortress designer Marshal Vauban. By going overland and not by sea, the New Englanders outflanked the immobile French troops in the fortress. Many New Englanders at Louisbourg kept diaries.
Got some of the great artillery on shore and began to transport them, which was attended with incredible difficulty, there being no possibility of drawing them with horses or oxen. The enemy did not seem to apprehend the possibility of our transporting battering cannon over those grounds, but our men seemed resolved to surmount all difficulties.
Anonymous New England soldier, May 5th and 6th, 1745. By the end of the first day, Parties of New Englanders were already in place, close enough to snipe with their muskets at the French troops manning the walls of the fortress. Already, the hard work of pulling the cannons through the marsh began to pay off. Now the French began to discover the inadequacies in the design of their handsome fortress.
When the French came to fortify this harbor, they were considering how to deal with essentially a naval threat. They weren't looking to defend the harbor area against an attack from the land. So what they had to deal with was a long kidney-shaped harbor with a very narrow opening right at the center. And what they determined to do was to place the town at the southwest end of the harbor on a narrow spit of land and fortify that, then place a battery on the island which controls the narrow entrance into the harbor. As well, they were going to put another battery on the inner side of the harbor facing out towards its mouth.
To defend against attack from the sea, the traditionally trained French commanders ringed the harbor with gun emplacements. The biggest of these was not in the fortress itself, but stood on the shoreline overlooking the entire harbor.
The principal defense was a large battery called the Royal Battery or Grand Battery, located right here in a narrow V, or a shallow V rather, that faced outward into the harbor area. The French felt that they could control the harbor completely from any attack from the sea. The attacking forces did what the French did not expect anyone to do. They landed on the shores farther westward, marched inland, and encircled the harbor, thereby rendering the fortifications, which faced essentially seaward, useless.
The New Englanders had a good idea that they needed to land below the fortress because one of their initial objectives was to cut around behind the fortress up to the north shore of the harbor to seize the Royal Battery.
The Royal Battery was quickly decided at a council of war in 1745 to abandon it and to blow it up. However, the engineer who built it was part of the council, Verrier, and he pleaded and said, "No, don't blow it up, please."
Outflanked, the French decided to abandon the Royal Battery, and it was taken over by the New Englanders only 2 days after their landing on the beach. Now the siege of Louisbourg began in earnest. The New England soldiers kept the French garrison behind the walls, under constant fire, and slowly were able to move their cannon closer to the town. Then they poured heavy artillery into the fortress.
The New Englanders were very good gunners. They weren't all just country boys that hardly knew how to fire a shot.
The French were hoping for relief to arrive from France and were ready to hunker down and wait out their attackers. Unfortunately, the British naval presence was stronger than the French, and relief never arrived.
The naval force here wasn't strong enough at the time in 1745 to actually repulse the British Royal Navy force that was sent up from New England. So, because the French at this time had not kept a strong squadron here, just a few ships. Most of them were still over in Europe and hadn't crossed yet. There was, in fact, one that came in during the first siege, and there was quite a battle with that one, a 64-gun large French ship, but ran into the Royal Navy, and that was that.
When you fired a cast iron ball from a smoothbore cannon with a charge of black powder, It might range as far as 3 miles. The problem was that beyond a certain distance, let's say a mile or so, it was almost impossible to say where the ball was going to go. So that accurate gunnery was not really very possible. The only way to be sure of hitting something was to get as close to it as possible, which is why in naval combat, usually the vessels got as close to one another as they could to exchange fire back and forth. So if you had several hundred men cramped into a small space inside essentially a wooden container, and then you fired large iron balls at that container, when they impacted into the vessel, not only was there damage from the ball, but the flying splinters were what caused the terrible damage. The only other fear that ships had, what was called hot shot. When in a battery like the Royal Battery, there would be small shot furnaces that would heat these cast iron balls to a glowing red hot state, and a wet wad would be put in on top of the powder, and then this sizzling hot ball would be put into the gun and fired at a ship. And if it hit the ship and impacted and, say, wedged into the wood, of course, it was almost like putting a match into a tinderbox, and within a few seconds, the whole vessel could be ablaze.
Not only were the cannons inaccurate, but so too were the muskets, with an effective range of only about 60 yards. The tactics were to draw up in platoon or battalion formation and unleash volleys of shot. Since 100 muskets aimed in the same general direction were more likely to get results than any number of single marksmen. The French had the support of the local Micmac and Abenaki Indians, who did not like the New Englanders because the British colonists had come to North America to stay and had fought bitterly to take over Indian lands. But the help of the Indians was not enough. The French garrison was outnumbered, and it was merely a matter of time before the New Englanders and their English allies would take over the fortress. The New England force probably never had more than about 5,000 men, and although they were somewhat disorganized, their success in laying siege to such a powerful fortress was a remarkable testament to their energy.
There's some tremendous period views of towns under fire with mortar shells exploding. This is a 13-inch bomb. The shell itself would weigh just under 200 pounds, would be filled with approximately 7 pounds of powder, and was designed to explode. And of course, the shell would break, and it would cause damage to lighter structures and particularly to people. One advantage a mortar gave to artillerymen was that the shell would explode, so you could actually see where your shot landed. In total, there's probably something over 50,000 pounds of mortar shell sent into the town.
The great aim of siege engineers at the time was not so much to get infantry troops close to a place to attack it, but more to get close enough where with artillery, and particularly the use of mortars and shell bombs, you could pound a place into submission. And that's exactly what happened at Louisbourg, because it could blow apart buildings. It could, land anywhere and cause damage through the flying splinters and so on. So rather than being directly an anti-personnel thing, it was essentially a terror weapon.
The cannons, bombs, cohorns, etc., continually roaring on both sides. Women and children heard to screech and cry out in ye city when our bombs came amongst them.
Dudley Bradstreet, New England soldier, May 7th, 1745. Being in the open, the New Englanders were vulnerable to the fire from within the walls, and their casualties were about 100 dead. In those days, there was little help for soldiers wounded in battle, except for liquor to ease the pain, and it was common for wounded men to be left to die. The occupants of Louisbourg now learned a bitter truth. Those who were unfortunate enough to be besieged in a colonial fort were almost inevitably doomed. The siege of Louisbourg showed that the New England colonies had come of age. Their energy, wealth, and population had been mobilized to overcome the greatest imperial fortress in North America. The expedition had not been well planned. In fact, was rather ramshackle. But its verve, daring, and immense energy had carried it to the first impressive military victory the New England colonists had ever won. In only 6 weeks, start to finish, a great fortress fell to an amateur army of colonists.
The general went in and took possession of the city of Louisbourg, the greatest conquest that ever was gained by New England.
Anonymous New England soldier, June 17th, 1745. Conditions for the New England volunteers in the captured Louisbourg were so bad that by the end of the first winter of occupation, 900 men had died from disease. The following spring, the New Englanders were finally relieved by the British Army. The colonists achieved a great deal with their victory. Of course, they got rid of the French and their control over the thriving cod fishery, and dealt a blow to a hated religious enemy. But perhaps more importantly, the removal of the military threat also removed an argument for the British Army to remain in the colonies. Fate had in store an even more bitter blow for the New Englanders. Only 3 years after the colony soldiers had captured the fortress at such cost and hardship, the British handed it back to the French. France had captured Madras in India, and the British wanted it back.
The French came back considerably reinforced. The garrison was now much bigger. I think there had been 8 companies of soldiers before. Now there were 24.
When the fortress was turned back in 1749 to the French, of course, the immediate reaction, particularly in Massachusetts, which was a hotbed of the Revolution, some years later, was, look at the effort we went to capture this place, which really we don't want to have around. And now you've handed it back because you've got concerns about property in India. British government would say, well, no, we have to balance everything, and we'll look after your interests, but we've got to worry about India too. We have profits to be made and so on. So there was already the beginning of an irreconcilable argument starting. So the impetus to take Louisbourg by the New Englanders and the loss of it in 1749 probably was one of the beginning irritants that did lead to the American Revolution.
A decade later, the game had changed again. For the second time, the British laid siege to Louisbourg in 1758, determined this time to drive the French out of North America. Now, the full power of the British Army and Navy was mobilized, concentrating thousands of men and dozens of ships on blockading the port. This time, the colonists were not involved.
During the 1758 attack, when the British boats were coming ashore and rowing towards the sandy beaches of Kennington Cove, the French waited until the boats were quite close in and then opened up such an intense fire that the British boats turned away, thinking that the attack was impossible. But 3 boats spotted a small rocky beach. James Wolfe saw them heading towards it, realized that that small bit of rocky beach was sheltered from the French guns, and he rowed for it as well, signaling to the other boats to follow him.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there just for a second because I want to discuss a couple things that you may not know about the fort itself. During the construction of the fort at Louisbourg, contractors used, just like it's happened even in current day, did shortcuts trying to line their pockets. And what they did is, instead of using fresh water to mix their mortar and the concrete, they used seawater. And of course, what happens with seawater, with all that salt, it weakened the cement so much that it was basically, the walls were crumbling. They could have been 17 feet thick, but they were extremely weak compared to what they should have been. The other thing that they didn't do was behind the fort, there was a area of bluff that they didn't consider worth defending. So they left it wide open. So when the fort was attacked, instead of going from the heavily fortified side, the attackers went to the hilly side that was available to them, and they bombarded the city. So that's something I hope they bring up here, but that actually did happen, and it's one of the reasons, believe it or not, both sides used that tactic in order to gain the fort. So I found that rather interesting.
The siege of Louisbourg was won by James Wolfe's audacity, and the first demonstration of that audacity was on that 35 or 40-foot stretch of rock where James Wolfe splashed ashore. When the English arrived in 1758, and the British Army and the Royal Navy arrived, they had some 13,000 men, and it was an enormous undertaking. And yet, it was remarkable to French eyes in particular that such a large force would take so long in taking the fortress, when the New Englanders in 1745 had wrapped up the job in 6 weeks.
In 1758, the British were more cautious. But within a day or two, the attacking forces began the assault on the fortress.
Madame Drucour, who was the governor's wife in the second siege, to encourage the soldiers, would go out and fire a gun every day. So naturally, the British general on the other side made sure that when she came out to fire her gun, they wouldn't fire at her. So the British battery would stop, and she'd fire her gun, and the French guys would cheer, and she'd go back.
There's your white flag.
The French, of course, had lost the fortress. But to those who ran the fortress, there was something more important. In the 18th century, if you lost an objective, you could always win it back the next year. But you must never give up your social standing, because that was ordained by God. Having once again captured the great fortress, the British now had to decide what to do with it. This time, the war between the two nations was taking place around the globe, and neither could be sure of winning. It was conceivable even that the fortress might once again fall into French hands. So the British decided to destroy the town of Louisbourg and deport the entire population back to France. The fall of Louisbourg sealed the fate of the French Empire in North America. The following year, Quebec fell to General Wolfe. To ensure that the French never came back to Louisbourg, the British decided to get rid of the fortress. February 9th, 1760, the Prime Minister of England to the commander of the British forces in North America.
The king has come to a resolution that all the fortifications of the town of Louisbourg be forthwith totally demolished and razed, and all the materials so thoroughly destroyed as that no use may hereafter be ever made of the same.
By 1760, Louisbourg lay in ruins and stayed that way for 200 years. Both sides in the imperial struggle, the French especially, had poured vast resources into this outpost that had dominated the battle for North America for 4 decades. 4 decades, one might think in retrospect, of the theater of the absurd. Buried in those destroyed foundation stones were the coins sent by the King of France in 1720, depicting a youthful Louis XV on one side and the Louisbourg he was going to build on the other.
Ooh, I'd like one of those.
The king's dream was revived only when the Canadian government decided to restore the fortress in the 1960s, exactly 200 years after the British demolished it. The idea was to employ 800 displaced local miners who had been thrown out of work. The restoration was one of the most impressive ever undertaken, and was carried out with such meticulous historical accuracy that it now draws thousands of people from across the continent every year to relive a turbulent period in our history.
If we get a chance, let's visit it.
Louisbourg was worth preserving. It had played an important role in developments leading to 2 of the most significant events of the last 300 years, the French and the American revolutions.
The Americans, when they captured this town in 1745, it gave them a tremendous sense of confidence. Louisbourg may have had something to do with the sparkling of the idea of an independent people in the United States.
In France, you had an increasingly bankrupt government through the 18th century, finally running out of gas and faced with a social upheaval that they simply couldn't control by the end of the century. Both the cost of Louisbourg and the loss of Louisbourg helped pull one of those legs out from under the tottering structure that was the Kingdom of France.
Sure, it cost money. But when you start looking at fortifications across France that was built at the same time and the enormous expenditure that just a couple of ships of war would cost, there was nothing here in 1715. And by 1740, this must have brought out a lot of revenues and also a lot of safety for the ships that were going back and forth. Sure, it cost money, but it certainly didn't ruin France.
For the English, it was a key moment, a key pinnacle in their nation's history. And it resulted in the gaining of most of a continent.
As far as France is concerned, they could live without Louisbourg. But there's a bit of an irony that, say, 30, 40 years later, they come to the aid of the Americans. And those same Americans that had first brought their military experience and their confidence here in Louisbourg.
The Louisbourg campaign, which started here in this beach, marked the beginning of a violent and turbulent period in the history of North America, which would lead in 1760 to the fall of New France and would, several steps further, eventually lead to the American Revolution.
Well, that was quite interesting. And it's extremely important that folks know this little bit of history because it impacted not only Canada but effectively the United States, especially with the expulsion of the Acadians. Hence, you've got all those Cajuns and folks down in the Louisiana area that can trace their family history back to that area. So it's quite interesting. And it was again a violent time to live. It was a time when nations were claiming areas for each other. It's quite an interesting thing. I'm going to bring up my good friend Kyle, and he has got something to share with us, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey there, buddy. How are you, Skipper?
I'm doing fine, sir. How are you doing?
I'm enjoying the history lesson today. That was kind of fun.
Yeah, it's a lot of people don't realize how much that impacted North America.
Yeah, and then they were talking about the artillery batteries, and of course that's close to my heart. Of course, if that battle had taken place 250 years later, instead of the fire shot, it would have been a white phosphorus we put in there to catch it on fire. But yeah, there's a 110-pound artillery round. Hip height to a 6-foot man, that's 3 feet of bad news right there. Well, I had to shave my beard off. I was growing it long for my granddaughter, and then she got bored because tugging on it didn't hurt me. But yeah, 250 years later, and then of course those little cannoneer things, little teeny tiny things, they got a little bit bigger through the centuries.
Oh yeah, of course.
That's me perched on a 198 155 millimeter howitzer. That's down in that, and the thing I'm hip hugging the shells is down in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba.
Oh yeah.
Here's an action shot of a team loading, setting, and shooting. And then our little pop gun, of course, that's a 105 millimeter howitzer.
Familiar with that one.
Yeah, and we're right outside of North Korea on this one. That gun's pointed at North Korea. We had the range to impact North Korea with that in '88 there, just to show a force thing. But that just was up there when I was laughing about the artillery part that came up. But since it was about Louis XV, I'm gonna do this and.
It must have really caught your attention when they're talking about superheating the cannonballs.
Oh yeah, big time. Now here's I don't know how well it's going to show up here without the magnification, but this is a 1769 Irish halfpenny.
See if I can get you on there.
See if I can even get the date to show up here. But this was colonial currency pre-Revolutionary War. I don't think, maybe if I put direct light on it. Let me get a flashlight here. I got a, well, no, I had a flashlight right over my shoulder. Hold on a second.
Yeah, he was Roman. He was in Cuba, and he was in
inside. It was usually sitting right over my shoulder here. But I wonder if I put direct light on it, if it won't wash it out all the way.
Oh, it's interesting. All the little ridges through it.
Yeah, it's beat all the tar, but pre-American Revolutionary War money. Like I said, 1769 Irish halfpenny.
Very
I was
cool.
tickled by that because 1769, which again was, what, 20 odd years after the first siege and just under 10 years after the second siege there. But from 1760 into the 1770s, of course, the leader of France was Louis XV. And again, I just don't know. Maybe if I put some light on this, it'll take some glare off.
Whoa, original binding.
Virgin Dios. Virgil in Latin and French. I go to the back pages first for this one little thing. where it was printed, Rue de Galais, 1769. And for those that like Roman numerals, of course, it's a lambskin. Louisbourg. Virgil in Latin and French from the French Royal Library, 1769. And that's the French Royal Crest. This came out of the Louis XV's Royal Library.
Good gravy. And how did it come into your possession?
It just worked its way around the world. Now, of course, in the early 1900s, and I could clean this all up, make it go away. I don't want to because there's history here. This at one point was a library book in Urbana, Ohio.
Oh, it's too bad they put, that actually reduces the value of the book.
Yeah, but that would come out easy enough. This is irrelevant, but there's
That's
history.
amazing, though.
But there's history here. The fact that this set in an Ohio library, and they had no idea. No one took the time to figure out, even though it says from the French Royal Library, and the most basic of research, that is the stamp of the French Royal Crest, and it's a stamp.
Amazing.
That goes through, and this thing was in France in 1769, somewhere in Ohio, probably in the 1920s, and in Indianapolis around 2015 when I got it.
Unbelievable.
But I've had this about 10 years now. But yeah, that's an original stamp of the French Royal Crest for Louis XV.
Very cool.
So, one of the coolest pieces I have in my library, and I got that for next to nothing. Quite literally next to nothing. And again, it just kind of fell through the cracks traveling around the world.
Right.
And just the slightest of research, and I'm like, wonder what the French Royal Crest was back then, before I even thought to read that it says from the French Royal Library, which is what it says there, and then look at the crest, and that is a stamp, a clear stamp of the French Royal Crest from 1715 to like 1772. So that book belonged to King Louis XV. Now it belongs to me.
Isn't that cool?
Just one of them quirky little things in the world.
Nice piece for your collection. My goodness.
Yeah. And again, I mean, it would take no time flat to get that out of there, because I mean it's hanging by a thread. That library thing's hanging in there by a thread. And again, it's old like rubber cement, which basically would just roll right out, so leaving almost no damage. But I love the history of that thing. I love the fact that it crawled across the world and went unbeknownst, because I'm sorry, if I'd have found that in like 1930 at the library, I'd be like, I'm gonna pay overdue fees and keep this book. This belonged to the King of France over 200 years ago. Yeah.
I was really fascinated when they started showing the coins they found in Louisbourg. Of course, they're the French ones. One of the things a lot of people don't realize that after Henry VIII is endeavors to devalue his money by watering down the gold, even after Queen Elizabeth took over, she tried to increase the purity of it, but the English currency had taken such a hit that merchants would take little scales to measure it to make sure that it had the right quantity of precious metal in it. Well, that took not decades. It took literally hundreds of years to rectify, because even during this time, during like the 1740s, 1750s, merchants didn't want British silver or gold. They preferred silver from the Spanish, especially the reals. It had a reputation for a far higher purity content, And in the colonies, the British Crown were really hesitant about sending anything silver over there. They ended up getting non-precious metals. So you could find a lot of that through metal detecting and whatnot, but very, very little silver or gold. It's just, unless, of course, you might come across a Spanish real, you know. So piece 8, yeah, you can get them, but a lot of the British coins you just couldn't get because they were just not popular.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure this Irish coin's just flat lead or something. It's heavy and it's sturdy, but
That's
not
very small.
fancy.
Yep.
But just kind of feels like a lead token. But somebody got bored with it and tried to put it under a train or something. So lots of history in the 246 years since then. So 245 years.
Awesome.
I love history.
That's why we're doing this. We do we do collect, but we want to get into the history of what went on. I mean, when you're holding, like, you have your book or a coin, and you look at what that's gone through to get to you.
Yeah.
I mean, wow, it just boggles the mind.
Yeah, then I think of the ancient ones I got to go back over 2,000 years, and it's like, how many hundreds, if not thousands of hands has this gone through? What has it bought? And now it just sits in a sleeve thing up in my library.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and what could it buy now? Now, granted, I couldn't buy anything directly, but, you know, I could sell it. Then the transaction from that, I could buy something else. And then, you know, one little coin, hell, even this coin could have fed a family 10 times over.
Yeah.
With different breads or whatever the case may be.
A lot of the younger folks can't really relate to especially the inflation and how money has been devalued over the years. But I can state right from the top of my head, since 1974, and this is pretty close to being exact, $100 worth of groceries in 1974 will cost in today's money over $650. And that's groceries. Now, don't even get into real estate, because real estate's gone insane. I bought a house in '73 that cost me $18,000. It was a double lot. It was a bungalow, and that same house went last year in Windsor, Ontario, for $1 million. I mean, that's just within my lifespan. I mean, can you well imagine going back further? Well, I've heard my grandfather, I'm sure you have. The further back you go, money went a long way, and you didn't get near as much as what we're getting now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the house I live in now would basically, in the 1740s, be considered a castle.
Yeah.
You know, like, quite literally considered a 2-story castle. It's enormous. It's gaudy, but it's just basic for the neighborhood I'm in. But, you know, if I had a family back then, I'd be in a little hut. And I'd just be a footstool.
We have a lot of amenities that we enjoy. And, you know, yeah, the houses are a lot better. But honestly, I wouldn't want to live, having done so much research over the last couple months on the 1700s in North America. Forget it.
Yeah.
No way I'd want to live back then.
I got dysentery once in my world travels. I'd never want that again. And dysentery was like a monthly thing back then.
Yeah. Christopher Ty, you're nice try, buddy. Because you can't compare U.S. and Canadian anymore, because I remember when we used to get $1.03 U.S. to 1 Canadian, so ours was actually worth more. But now it's worth 2/3 or 3/4 of what the U.S. is now. It's stupid. So it's really hard when you're talking, you know, comparing different world currencies. Again, the U.S. tends to be the standard worldwide, and that's what we tend to look at, saying how much my money is worth compared to the U.S. It's been brutal, especially in the last few years. I want to buy anything from the States, or if I want to go for a vacation anywhere, it's going to cost in the U.S. It's going to cost me way more than what it used to.
Oh yeah, and then the shipping has just become criminal around the world.
It has. It really has.
I mean, in no way, shape, or form is it 10 times more expensive to ship anything, but they don't even try and justify the rate hikes to that high.
I was absolutely flabbergasted by some of the. As you know, we do a lot of coin exchanges and grab bags and that sort of thing. And the last one I sent out cost me $24, and it wasn't even a big package to send down to Illinois.
Yeah, that's just
like $24. That's crazy.
Yeah, but, I think it'd be a stretch to charge a third of that, and not get the value, because the markets didn't quit moving, but everybody's like, they hired Louis DeJoy here to run the post offices like 10 years ago, and he's just running into the ground. And everybody's getting greedy, and they're like, competition this, competition that. Well, competition's supposed to bring it level. It's supposed to level the playing field, not jack up everybody's prices. You know, it's supposed to be a reasonable choice. Well, you can pay 24 or 26 or 28, so you pay to 24. When the option should be, if you're going to pay more than $24 for a small package ship, you better get a 2-day international or something, you know, because it's all the same thing. They're getting on an airplane, they're going somewhere. It takes up this much space. That much space is only worth that much money. Ridiculous.
How's it going, Doug? I hope you got your package by now. Yeah, I'm still running that daily contest for especially. I'm trying to encourage younger collectors to do their own research.
Yeah,
and I'm rewarding them, you know, every 7 days with a sticker pack, and every 42 days I've been sending out a 5-ounce copper round as a reward for doing. But they have to do the research, and it has to be detailed. Not just say, oh yeah, that's the queen on there. You know, that's not quite what I'm looking for. I want you to do your own research. You know, they've got to learn. If they want to get in the hobby, they got to get into it.
Yeah, because it's a piece of history, and you're not just looking at one single thing. You're looking at the history that goes with it, and what it meant. And
yeah, you don't want to be just that type of person where you just throw your coins into a jar and forget about them. Because that's not really, that's collecting. That's not collecting. Yeah, I also collect books too, but I don't have any as dated as yours though.
I have letters, personal letters that go back over 200 years with wax stamps on them.
Oh wow!
Just beautiful stuff. Just touches of history. And for the life of me, I can't get anybody that interested in it, you know. And I've got presidential. I got one of the more recent things I got were press corps photos from the White House press corps itself, from the White House. I got shots of Jimmy Carter introducing a new secretary, for South American Affairs or whatever, in like 1978, and it's the original black and white stamped with the White House press photos, and they're like, you know, here's a copy of these for you guys to print out, and here's what they are, and it had a breakdown on a little teletype. Absolutely gorgeous piece of history. But again, if we don't teach kids, it's like, well, whatever, he was president way before my lifetime, big deal. It's like it's just a sliver of history, and it's something unique. And you got to be interested in history because all it keeps doing is repeating itself in technological advancement. The only thing that changes is technological advancement. Other than that, it's pissing contest for small pieces of land.
Yeah, that's why cancel culture is so bad. I mean, we want, regardless of what happened in history, good or bad, it's led us to where we are now, and we don't need to forget everything. Oh, heaven forbid. You need to know what went on to bring us to that point where we are today, and again, to avoid repeating the same mistakes we've done in the past.
But every 10 to 20 years, the cycle just
Yeah,
returns.
I've noticed that. Isn't that something? I thought at the end of the Cold War, that was it. Okay, we're going to see peace finally. No, I'm shocked how far it's gone the other way already.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Humanity is kind of ridiculous, but they want more than what they need. I get stopping tyranny. Ones that made perfect sense. World War II, perfect sense, made perfect sense, but we still went too far. I'm an old vet, and it may have saved more lives, but I'm sorry, that is just sadistic. An atomic bomb is sadistic.
Yeah.
That's just sadistic. You don't wipe out that many people, that many civilians, kill the combatants. If you're going to drop it on an atoll. I mean, Iwo Jima is a sacred place, but it's an island of volcanic rock. If you're going to drop a nuke on that, take out the soldiers, take out the island, make the statement. You don't kill as many people, but you make the statement, and it's all military combatants.
Yeah.
It could have been, that would have been my argument back then, is
it's
something like that slightly removed from.
It's a case where you're, and I see where you're coming from. It's so much the civilians that take the brunt of it. I mean, soldiers, yeah, that's the job that they have to do.
Yep.
But when you start seeing stuff, even like the bombing of Dresden, that was a horrible mistake. That should never have happened.
Yeah.
Firebombing an entire city.
Yeah.
There's certain things in our history that we're ashamed of, and we better not ever repeat it. But we should never forget it either.
Yeah. It should always go back to battlefields. If you're having your little contest, put the leaders right in the middle on the horses, charging the battlefield, winner takes all, whatever.
Isn't that the problem now? The leaders aren't up there.
They just keep getting further and further and further in the back, and now they hide in the bunker and push a button. It's like, get the hell out of the bunker. If you're going to push the button, get out there and lead the charge. If you're the leader, be a leader. Don't be hiding in the back. It would stop so many unjustified things, and it would draw these people out in the open. These fighters. I despise nothing more than, like, if they build a tunnel under a hospital and strike from that. I'm like, I would firebomb the entire tunnel system just to take them away from doing something that stupid, so we don't end up carpet bombing civilians to get to people that are down under that. It's like, humanity's just awful for that. It's like, if you're going to fight, draw your sword and run at the guy you're fighting. Have some nobility in this.
Unfortunately, we live in a day and age where people are okay with war as long as they're not looking the guy eye to eye. I mean, if they had a look face to face with them, it'd be a whole different story.
And war is a simple thing, you can call me a pacifist veteran. I was break glass in case of war. I was all love and honey until I didn't have to be. Break glass in case of war, put me somewhere like a chess piece and say, here we are flexing our muscles. But don't set me loose unless there's a justifiable reason to mow somebody down. If there's a genocide, you plant me right in the middle of that, and I will die for that. Mm-hmm. But if you're just, I want that and they have it and I'm going to take it away. No, that's not justifiable.
Guys, what Kyle is saying, I agree with him 100%. As a veteran myself, I will tell you, no sane soldier wants war. We prefer a suntan unit. We prefer to enjoy ourselves.
Yeah, give me a beer at a beach.
Oh, exactly. But in case of war, we're ready.
Yeah.
And that's the big difference. A lot of people don't realize that's the way of that. And you ask any veteran, it's the same thing.
If you'll pardon my French, I'll change this colloquialism a little bit. When it hits the fan, it's our job to run in front of the fan so none of it splashes on other people behind it, and then shut the fan off.
Yeah.
You know, get the fan shut off, problem solved.
Yeah.
You know, if I go down, shut the fan off, well, then the guy behind me is going to, you know, I'm going to take the shrapnel that he doesn't have to, and then just carry these little scars where they sewed pieces of me back on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it hit the fan, I got in the fan's way, problem solved. So, and then with that, it's like, you know, just how did they not learn? You leave your rear flank exposed. It's like, well, yeah, we're going to fortify up here. Who's going to do that? Anyone with common sense is who's going to do that.
You would think so. And the funny part about that was the British didn't learn from the lesson, because they took advantage of the high point and bombarded the city with artillery after hauling their artillery pieces through the swamp. They got it up on the hill, bombarded Louisbourg, and of course, then the French end up surrendering. But now the British have taken over the fort, and they left the same bloody area open. It was undefended. So it repeated itself. Like, you think live and learn, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially considering that's the people that were in there, you know. If it was generations removed and maybe it just got forgotten at time, that's forgivable. But they went and did it and went, hey, this worked. Why won't somebody do it again? No, they won't do it again. Come on.
Must have been a politician.
That's where you put foot patrols back there, you know. You put foot patrols back there. You mark it off, you know.
Yeah.
It's just mind-boggling, and they just keep doing stuff like that. It just keeps time and time and time again, and it's like you just can't people learn, and people come into power and go, I want that, do this, and 100 guys look back and go, you know, hitting at that angle is incredibly stupid. If we did this and did that, it'd make more sense. But it's like, nope, we're not going to listen. You go do that. Why? Why do these puppeteers, the puppets themselves, just not listen to people around them going, you know, if you need this done, do it this way. You know, nobody wants to hear of 100,000 troops going somewhere, but I'm sorry, if you send 100,000 people somewhere and go, here's the flex, here's our muscle, we're here, it sits down and shuts up a lot of people. You know, you don't have to do much more than show of force to get the job done if you got the numbers. But then the British thought, hey, we're going to pull our 30,000 in here, or the French pull their 30,000 in there. And it's like, oh, we're going to show a force from the front. No, surround them. Once you got them surrounded, what are they going to say? All right, you know.
Because again, this is the aristocratic class that are taking on these officer roles,
Yeah.
and they're book learned from ancient tactics that don't work.
Yeah.
I mean, they may have worked at one time, but again, when you're fighting forces that are using tactics that don't coincide with yours, you're going to get wiped out. And a classic example was during the Revolutionary War, where you had the U.S. with their Minutemen and they're using tactics they learned from the native Indians, where they would go and hit and runs, and you know, they weren't stupid enough to stand in a thin red line and just wait to be shot at. They said, "Frick you! I'll let our job is to let you die for your country, not for mine."
Now, granted, technically, chemical warfare started in the 1500s, so glad they didn't learn from a century before, where they'd take bodies that died of the plague and they'd catapult them over castle walls.
Yeah, that's an interesting
At
point.
least they learned from that.
Yeah. The Boer War, the Boers, during the Paardeberg Drift expedition, they actually were taking their dead, especially the horses and whatnot, and throwing them in the water downstream from the British, and it was tainting the water, and it actually made all the British sick. So they were actually using biological warfare even in South Africa during the Boer War.
Yeah, and then pox blankets and all that stuff like that. Just cruelty. Humanity's cruel to humanity.
I know.
Just endless. And it's just a power struggle. That why struggle for power? Love thy neighbor. Simple enough.
That would be nice, wouldn't it?
Love thy neighbor.
Yeah.
You don't have to like them. Just live in peace with them.
Yeah.
I don't like a lot of my neighbors. I still live in peace with them, even though a lot of them are raging idiots.
I'm a firm believer too that if you have a belief system that's contrary to another's, respect the other person and don't try to force stuff on them. And I'm seeing a lot of that these days, where different faiths and different cultures are trying to overpower. Oh, it's really bad in France and in Germany right now.
Yeah.
You got to respect the local people as well.
Yeah, and it's just, you could have the simplest rules. If you're not hurting the innocent, if you're not hurting women or children, you go do you. Just let it be. You go do you. You hurt women and kids, then,
Oh, well, that crosses a boundary.
It hits the fan.
Yeah, it does.
If you start hurting people for no reason, you're over.
Yeah.
But if you don't, believe what you want to believe, feel how you want to feel, live in your own little bubble, I ain't going to pop it. You do something way out of line, that's when you pop the bubble, not, hey, I want my bubble bigger and your bubble's in my way, so I want to take it. Like, no. I already have it. I'm medically being broken with my cancer fight, but if I have something and somebody outside my house needs it, I have one word for them. Here. Here. What do you owe me? Pay it forward. If you have something and somebody else needs it, here. Let it grow that way. Here. Don't come in and take it. Come in and say, I need, you have 3 of. Well, I don't need 3. Here's here. And if the world would do that, utopia.
Yeah.
It'd be utopia. And people just can't go here. One word in the English language, that translates easy enough. Here. I give unto you because you need. Not come take it. Don't take somebody else's stuff by force. Because we all have too much in the modern world. And anybody that's seen the third world knows, with us, our kids played in cardboard boxes. And in third world countries, people make houses out of them, and they're more important than gold. Gold does them nothing. Cardboard box helps shelter them from a typhoon. Money means nothing.
Well, it's not like we can take it with us.
Yeah, and it's just it's a showpiece. And how can you go spend it? I've got a fortune from all these countries and all this past history. That's value is only intrinsic now. I can't just walk out and go, here, give me that much that's worth this much of the value, because it isn't there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But what is our value? Well, we said this, but here's a piece of paper that says I have that.
Yeah.
Come on. Just go here. It's not even charity. It's just basic human decency.
Yeah, it doesn't have to even be material things. Giving of yourself.
Yeah.
I run across a young lad. Believe it or not, he was just getting ready to move into a new position in a bank, and he was working for a local casino here. And I run across him. He says, Scouter Pat," which is what I went at as a scout leader. He says, "Scouter Pat, what are you doing in here?" I says, "Oh, I'm just in here having dinner and maybe playing a few slot games with my wife." And he said, "Well, man, is it ever nice to see you? I've been looking for you for years." I said, "Really?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "I wanted to thank you for everything you did for me. You got me off the street. You got me to finish school. You got me to take the training I needed to get into a position where now I got myself a really good job I'm going into, and it's all because of the time you spent with us." That was that was the greatest reward I could possibly have.
There is no amount of money you could put on that.
Nope, none at all.
Just there is no monetary value you can put on that. That stuff like that in a child's laughter, you say, hey, my grandkids' laughter, $1 billion. Grandkids' laughter, keep your $1 billion.
Really, what are you going to leave behind? That's the thing you're going to leave behind.
Then those kids, the kids that you help, I have stories akin to that where I helped these kids 25 years ago. They trickle back into my life and say, "Thanks, you helped me a lot." And it's like that thank you carried the world with it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I wasn't there to do anything but try and change the world for the better. A little bit did happen to cross paths with that person, and they said it did. So, I could finally go, I did a piece of good in the world. Let's hope they pay it forward. And then we have the money to remember, but there's just no amount of money worth those. I'd give up everything to hear that once a day that I did that in my life. That meant I led the most exceptional life. But I haven't, but I try. So
that's all we can do, though.
And then, like with this, I was like, well, I know you're doing your show, but that's why I politely send the thing. Hey, if afterwards and this plays, if you want to see that, here's a little bit of my time to go. Hey, world, here's this, and if you think that's neat, here's the story and the history that went with it, and hopefully somebody will go seek that out and go, I'd like to have something akin to that. Seek it out, find it, and it's all out there. There's billions of stories waiting to be told.
That's very true. Very true. My goodness. So what are your plans for the rest of the week this week?
I've got some plumbing issues I've been dealing with and having people in and out, and hopefully the problem's solved and it stops leaking through my ceiling. Little grandbaby time. Prepping for a big appointment next month with my oncologist that I'm really not looking forward to.
Right.
So, because it's not going to be good. I've hit my peak of recovery, and now I'm kind of going like this and slowly creeping back.
Oh man.
I'm trying to keep a happy face on it, but they're going to be shoving cameras in unmentionable places and telling me bad news.
Yeah, I've dealt with the malignant melanoma, bladder and colon cancer.
Yeah.
And I know the treatments are not nice.
Yeah.
And if you get through it, fine. What's got me now is my hip. It's not even the cancer. It's the bloody my hip has gone bad on me. So, and that's dragged me down more than anything else, because now the best I can do is use a walker in the mall, or a cane if I'm doing a short distance, and it's making it really hard for me to do my seasonal winter thing as Santa. So it's made it really tough. But the best joy I get is when I go into a mall with my walker and I'll find some old codger there next to me with a walker and I'll challenge him to a race. Makes his
day. Go. There you go. You got to find the bright light in it.
You got her.
But yeah, I'm in this window right now where, they talk about survivability rates in 5-year increments. Well, I've switched from one increment to the next. So my survivability went from 75 to 80% to 15 to 30%.
Just live every day like it's your last.
And that's all you can do.
Yeah.
Trying to be positive, because
That's it.
if not, it'd just eat my brain up.
We're all going to end up in the same place anyway. Well, I hope.
Yeah.
I don't want any flames where I'm going.
But you're a good man there, sir. So I think you're safe and sound.
Well, I hope so. I tried to tell my wife that.
Yeah. Yeah, that one's a battle. I was actually talking to my wife yesterday about that, and I'm like, I'd like to think that I left an indelibly good mark on the world, but if I look back, there's a good stretch where no, I didn't. I
But
had my
we've all
moments.
done that, though. Come on, Kyle. We've all done that.
Yeah.
We're things we're not we're ashamed of, or we wish we hadn't. But yeah, hopefully you've learned, which I think you have.
Wow. Spent a good chunk of my life blowing stuff up and getting paid to do it, and drinking and
I've
sitting
been
on
here for 22 years.
yeah, drinking and sitting on beaches and just
Yeah, that's my favorite part. So anyway, guys, I'm going to call her quits for the day. I'll see you again next week. Kyle, if you want to stick around for a few minutes after I end the stream. But I want to thank everybody for coming out. I hope you've enjoyed the history. The same bat time, same bat channel next week. And we'll have another rendition of Canadian history and the massacres that went on Canadian soil. And I hope you enjoy it. And again, keep up with the competition, the daily competition. It's getting good now. So thanks, everyone.
always appreciate spending time with you and these good people.
You bet. Take care, everyone.